You know, we're all about abolishing unjust hierarchies on this channel, but I want to talk about one in particular that doesn't get a lot of play. I want to talk about labels, in particular mental health labels. This is not going to be a video about how mental health labels have historically been rooted in repression. I'm not going to engage in that kind of Foucaultian anti-psychiatry analysis, even though I think there's a lot of merit to it. This also is not going to be a video about how these labels are highly subjective and relative, because I think the bulk of data that is uh, meant to substantiate the utility of these labels um, has been replicated, and the amount of people who tend to be helped by the various practices associated with ameliorating whatever symptoms are caused by these mental health labels or conditions seem to work for the people who it's working for. And I reckon if there's that many people who relate to these diagnoses, and when they get the diagnosis and the subsequent treatment, they feel as though they finally understand themselves and they finally have a route that they can go down that leads to fulfillment, happiness, betterment, and so forth, then they pose some utility. Like, there's a purpose for these things to be here, and I'm not going to be arguing against that either. But I do want to say they can get in the way sometimes. I think, you know, the point of getting a diagnosis is generally to not qualify for that diagnosis in the future, or at least in principle, that's what it should be. This is also not going to be a video about how Big Pharma would like to perpetuate uh, mental health conditions and the continual diagnosis or qualifying for that diagnosis amongst various individuals to sell prescriptions to people. It's not going to be a video about that either. Um, what I want to talk about is these labels in relation to how we view ourselves and how we behave. Um, I think if you look at something like personality disorders, the mere concept that someone's personality can be disordered is kind of giving up at the start. I think there are significant areas where people will ultimately relate to having a personality disorder. Did these guys take my wallet? I think they might have. I guess I gotta look for it later. Um, I'm being attacked by puppies as I record this. But um, the idea that your entire personality can be disordered is kind of like giving up at the very beginning. I know there are a lot of people who relate to the symptoms or tendencies of something like BPD or ASPD, or even narcissistic personality disorder, and so on. Um, these are disorders where many of us can find aspects of ourselves in them, even highly specific aspects of the disorders many of us may relate to. Many of us may relate to them to a surprisingly high extent. Um, and I don't think seeing ourselves as people who these labels apply to and then seeing it as immutable is how we ameliorate the various problems associated with existing within that cluster of symptoms or having that set of traits slash behaviors. I think by recognizing that they exist in the first place and merely seeing oneself as a person, uh, you're much more likely to be rehabilitated. You're much more likely to have a rapid change in personality, um, or on your course of development in general. Um, there's a reason why they don't give out the diagnosis for personality disorders before you're 18. The idea is that is such a malleable time in your life that you being given that diagnosis may actually steer you in a particular direction. That you may associate your self concept with being someone who is in that cluster of symptoms, who has that label, that you won't actually get better, that you'll actually develop to become more like that person because it's now become part of your self concept at this pivotal time when you're changing a lot and you're super malleable as a person. But I think 18 is pretty arbitrary. Not just because your brain continues to develop until 25, but because we know that neuroplasticity exists and is highly variable. It is highly powerful in terms of how it can affect an individual. There has been research to suggest that massive changes in personality can occur even late into your life. Now, of course, it's less likely than for someone whose brain is still developing and they're still getting their feet wet with the world, getting a sense of everything that's going on, having formative experiences. But someone who's much older could just as well have a formative experience that fundamentally changes the way that they view something or view themselves, and they can change for the better. There are people who have been set in their ways as far as certain habits or tendencies are concerned, and late into their life have miraculously changed. That's the power of neuroplasticity. That's the power of human choice and the power of external factors as well. The setting up the conditions to create a good outcome. I think if these people who have these problems have an adequate amount of support from people who hold them to certain standards and are willing to keep them in contact with the outside world, with people who will not let them off the hook for every single bad thing that they do, but will also continue to accept them and love them in spite of their flaws, if they have that access to community, and if they get the help that they need, not on the basis of being someone with an immutable characteristic that also happens to be a terrible personality, then I believe these people can be helped through uh, whatever set of bad behaviors or symptoms they have. Um, I mean, Daniel Mackler, the YouTube psychotherapist, has literally said, in a firsthand account of his experience with patients that met the diagnosis for antisocial personality disorder, that they could heal, and that in his practice he had multiple clients that had this disorder and no longer met the criteria for it later, because they were able to find their inner child that felt empathy long ago, felt connection to others in the world long ago, that had been greatly suppressed in them uh, because of traumatic experience that caused them to exhibit these antisocial traits. And there are a variety of methods of therapeutic intervention for personality disorders in particular that, due to the stigma surrounding those labels, are rarely employed, or many psychotherapists simply do not want to touch those people. And I think it leads to this situation where a lot of people who could genuinely heal, and a lot of people who could be happy, productive, kind members of our society, are simply being left to the wayside. And I do not think that that is fair to them, and I think it is doing a disservice to who we are as a people. I think that's building a society that doesn't value life. And ultimately, um, at the core of this philosophy that I have to abolish these labels, at least in how we view ourselves, it comes from a uh, humanistic or moralistic standpoint that by simply casting people off as inherently disordered, I think we are sending the message to the world and to our country as a whole that we don't value life. And I don't think that's the message that we should be sending if we want to live in a world where there is harmony and where we all are able to work together. And so, um, changing ourselves is going to ultimately stem from um, changing how we view ourselves. I I think, if you look at, for example, a rehabilitative model of prisons in a country like Norway, reducing recidivism, um, ultimately the reason that occurs is because those people who are put in those prisons and receive the help that they need to not reoffend are also not treated as perpetuators of heinous crimes that must be punished to bring about justice for the victim. Rather, they are treated as human beings who made monumental mistakes but are capable of not making them in the future. And with the core goal of their justice system being rehabilitation and compassion, uh, to ultimately create a more peaceful and harmonious country, um, they're able to do that by telling these people that people care about them, they're capable of being loved, and that they're not inherently bad as people. If you go to prison in the United States and everyone around you is telling you that you're irredeemable, that you're a criminal, and that you deserve the kind of treatment that you're receiving, what exactly do you think those criminals are going to do when they get out of prison? I know my dad, for example, when he went to prison, came out knowing how to do a hell of a lot more crimes than when he came in. He learned that from when he was in there. And due to the marginalization and ostracization people get who had uh, who who had the record that he had, um, it pushed him into a situation where he had to commit crime again, and where um, it was ultimately more advantageous to do so, because if everyone in this society is going to treat me like I'm less than, and that's going to be the results that I see on a day-to-day basis due to this economic and social marginalization I'm facing as someone with this record, then fuck it. Why don't I reoffend? Why don't I do whatever is most advantageous to myself at the disservice of other people? Um, that's ultimately going to be the results of this justice system, and therefore the society that surrounds it. And so I think um, there's there is absolutely a component of punishment and retribution and and how we view these labels, and in particular like the stigma surrounding them, that's going to invariably worsen the mental health outcomes of the people who do end up identifying with them. And by simply not identifying with them at all, by attacking the individual problems at the root and explaining them all individually, perhaps rather than in the broader context of this uh, label that kind of puts an umbrella over a bunch of different clusters of traits, we're able to address those traits at the individual level based on whatever that individual needs. Um, and I think through uh, humanizing them and seeing them as people who fundamentally want to do good but have been strayed off the beaten path, um, you're going to be able to rehabilitate those folks who have problematic tendencies. I know myself, having done some really, really heinous things in the past, and thinking that I qualified for some kind of personality disorder as a result of how bad some of the things I did were, um, I ultimately came away from those circumstances not doing those things again because I had people who sincerely believed in me, and they held me to certain standards and helped me come to understand why exactly those things occurred and how to prevent them from occurring in the future. And they helped me through the process of forgiving myself to um, ultimately uh, instill better behavior. And now I don't act like the person that I used to be. But if I had listened to the voices of the people who said I was simply irredeemable, that I had no redeeming qualities whatsoever, that said that I would never change, that I would never get better, and that I should be pushed away from everyone, that I was a bad person. If I let those people determine my self-perception, if I let a label with a lot of social stigma surrounding it determine my self-perception, I would have just kept doing those horrible things. I would have kept making those terrible mistakes again and again and again and again. But because I had those compassionate and intelligent people in my life that allowed me to come to understand myself and helped me facilitate forgiveness of myself and helped me facilitate lasting, substantial changes in my behavior, that connection to that community, um, it made me a better person. Because I had all that, I became a better person. And so I think there's immense danger in, for example, self-diagnoses or perhaps any diagnoses, um, because it it creates a narrativistic conception of yourself, um, that it pathologizes behavior and traits that could very well be temporary. I know in my case a lot of this stuff ended up being temporary because I changed. And my fear is people are going to pathologize themselves, or be pathologized for certain traits or behaviors they have. And at the same time that this is occurring, social stigma will be applied to them or levied at them, and it will make them see themselves as though these are simply immutable characteristics, that there's no way out for them, and that continually reoffending is the only future that they have. But I think there's a brighter future that they have. They simply don't see it. And if we lived in a society, or at the very least communities, that allowed for those people to see it, to see that they could be better, that that is inside of them, that they're fully capable of change, then I think we'd have a lot less problems than we do right now. Um, I think everybody has had an experience where they were at a psychiatrist. Everybody who's mentally ill or diagnosed, I mean, um, or they were at a psychiatrist and they were asked questions that are basically just, do you have depression, or do you have borderline, or do you have autism, or do you have anxiety? That you hear the questions and you know exactly what they indicate. And I think many of the people who answer these, who already have a conception of themselves, answer them in a biased way. Like if they've already self-diagnosed, they're in a really dangerous position because they're going to answer them in whatever way contorts to the self-diagnosis that they've given themselves, um, rather than answering in the most honest way possible, which is really what you should be thinking about when you're asked these questions. You shouldn't be thinking about, is this depression or does this sound like depression? You should be thinking about, does this question relate to me, or do I relate to it? And then you respond accordingly. Um, it muddies the waters so much to have a narrative of yourself before you've spoken with a professional who spent relatively their whole life studying this stuff and being professionally trained to speak about these things with a degree of authority. A hell of a lot more authority than, random Joes like us have, at least. So I think self-diagnosis is a huge danger in and of itself, but in a broader sense, I do think labels, at the very least certain labels like personality disorders, can cause just as much harm, because the stigma surrounding them and how we may view ourselves in relation to them can be deeply unproductive. Ultimately, we should be attacking the behaviors themselves and learning the root cause of them, seeking forgiveness for ourselves, and addressing them in a substantial way that leads to lasting change in our behaviors, as well as keeping contact with a community of people that will hold us to certain standards and cares about us in so doing.